Stu, thanks for that gracious introduction. I kept looking over my shoulder for the person who was supposed to show up here. And as Stu alluded to, I've been writing about the evolution of these technologies long before terms like data science and big data became common currency. The fun bit of what I do, journalism, is that it's a curiosity license. You get to go out and talk to people and learn things. And this book project gave me an opportunity to go deeper than I would otherwise into what is obviously an undeniably rich subject. I signed up for it in 2012, but really got underway in earnest when I took a 7-month leave from the New York Times. And in the fall of 2013 through the spring of 2014. And Columbia University was kind enough to give me a bolt hole to stay in. And I was there for, and traveled from there. And these days, a decade ago when I did this, you could just beg space. Now you can't, so I was part of the Brown Institute, which is a collaboration of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and Stanford Engineering School. And they were kind enough to give me a place to work. What I'm going to do is read the first 2 pages of the book. Only 2, I promise. But I think it does give you a flavor of what I was up to and how I tried to go about it. After that, I was going to make a few observations about things I think I learned through the course of this research, and potentially and offer a few tentative answers, my tentative answers to, I think, some of the questions that this technology raises. The book begins with 2 short vignettes. One set in Memphis is a large product distribution center. The second is in Atlanta, and that is a large intensive care unit at Emory University, a medical research center. This will not be as good as the audiobook, but I'll give it a try. Just outside Memphis, an industrial symphony of machines and humans shuttles goods to and fro. Their carefully orchestrated movements and identifying marks tracked by barcode scanners and chips emitting radio waves. Medical arms snatch the plastic shrink-wrapped bundles off a conveyor belt as forklifts ferry the packages onto trucks for long-distance travel. Flesh and blood humans guide and monitor the flow of goods and drive the forklifts and trucks. McKesson, which distributes about 1/3 of all the pharmaceutical products in the United States, runs this sprawling showcase of efficiency. Its buildings span the equivalent of more than 8 football fields, forming the hub of McKesson's national distribution network. A feat of logistics that sends goods to 26,000 customer locations from neighborhood pharmacies to Walmart. The main cargo is drugs, roughly 240 million pills a day. The pharmaceutical business is one of high volume and razor-thin margins, so understandably, efficiency has been all but a religion for McKesson for decades. Yet in the last few years, McKesson has taken a striking step further, cutting the inventory flowing through its network at any given time by $1 billion. The payoff came from insights gleaned from harvesting all the product, location, and transport data from scanners and sensors, and then mining that data with clever software to identify potential time-saving and cost-cutting opportunities. The technology-enhanced view of the business was a breakthrough that Don Walker, a senior executive at McKesson, calls making the invisible visible. In Atlanta, I stand outside one of the glassed-in rooms in the 5th floor intensive care unit at the Emory University Hospital. Inside, a dense thicket of electronic devices, a veritable forest of medical computing, crowds the room. A respirator, kidney machine, infusion machines pumping antibiotics and pain-killing opiates, and gadgets monitoring heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and other vital signs. Nearly every machine has its own computer monitor, each emitting an electronic cacophony of beeps and alerts. I count a dozen screens, larger flat panels and smaller ones, smartphone-sized. A typical 20-bed intensive care unit generates an estimated 160,000 data points a second. Amid all that data, informed and distracted by it, doctors and nurses make decisions at a rapid clip, about 100 decisions a day per patient, according to research at Emory. So there's ample room for error. The overwhelmed people need help, and Emory is one of a handful of medical research centers that is working to transform critical care with data, both in adult and neonatal intensive care wards. The data streams from the medical devices monitoring patients are parsed by software that has been trained to spot early warning signals that a patient's condition is worsening. Dr. Timothy Buckman heads up one such effort at Emory. A surgeon, a scientist, and an experienced pilot, Buckman uses a flight analogy to explain his goal. GPS location data on planes is translated to screen images that show air traffic controllers when a flight is going astray, off trajectory, as he puts it, well before they crash. Buckman wants the same sort of early warning system for patients whose pattern of vital signs is off trajectory, before they crash, in medical terms. That's where big data is taking us, he says. The age of big data is coming of age, moving well beyond internet incubators in Silicon Valley, such as Google and Facebook. It began in the digital-only world of bits and is rapidly marching into the physical world of atoms, into the mainstream. The McKesson Distribution Center and the Emory Intensive Care Unit show the way. Big data saving money and saving lives. Indeed, the long view of the technology is that it will become a layer of data-driven artificial intelligence that resides on top of both the digital and the physical realms. And today we're seeing the early steps toward that vision. That's the end of the reading. So that's what I did. I ventured out into this wider world to get a feel of where this technology shines and where it stumbles. And I built the narrative around, in good part, around one young man and one old company. And Stu already referred to the old company. The young man is Jeff Hammerbacher, a data scientist. Some of you may well know him. He's 32 years old. And I chose him because the arc of his career really illustrates the spread and evolution of these quantitative techniques. He was an applied math major at Harvard. He went to Wall Street as a quant for about a year. He started the data team at Facebook, left there after about 3 years with a tidy sum and a reputation. Became one of the four founders of Cloudera, a company many of you are familiar with, I'm sure. He's still chief scientist there. But these days, he spends most of his time at Mount Sinai Medical Center here in New York. He thinks it's the best use of his skills. And I also chose him partly for his life story. We had an excerpt of it actually 2 weeks ago, Sunday, in the Times. But his father is a General Motors auto worker from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Mom's a nurse. Jeff is somebody who's stepped well beyond his background in life, beyond the data of his life. And the old company is IBM, whose data handling origins go back to its founding technology of the Hollerith punch cards. This was the cutting edge technology that was used to tabulate the 1890 census when the US population had surged to 63 million, which was the big data of its day. And with IBM, I use them mainly as a kind of its research arm as a conduit into some of these projects that are in kind of mainstream use across the economy. And both this McKesson and Emory examples are part of that. Initially, I was going to avoid Google, but it turned out I couldn't, because I did a fair bit of reporting on Nest for a chapter on what we're now calling the Internet of Things, or some call it the Industrial Internet. Talked to Tony Fadell at length, others there, Yoki Matsuoka, who has defected since I wrote this. And so Nest became a part of it, and because Google acquired them in 2014, before this book was, I had finished writing it. And in some ways, it's not surprising that Google is part of this. I mean, given its growth and evolution, I mean, with search, ads, language translation, image recognition, learning thermostats, self-driving cars, the underlying technology is much the same. It's, again, this layer of data-driven artificial intelligence. And in that sense, personalized search and targeted ads have a lot in common with personalized medicine and precision agriculture. So why is big data a big deal in the wider world? I think the main answer here is it's a powerful measurement revolution. And we've seen this before with other technologies that let you see things as never before. With the telescope, you were able to see biology and the mysteries of human life down to the cellular level. With a telescope, the analogy, you could look up into the stars and the galaxies and see man's place in the universe in a way you couldn't before. But I would argue that the data science is as a more generalized as computing is, a universal machine, Turing, right, is a more generalized tool than some that we've seen in the past. And if the internet transformed the economics of communication, which I think it did, I think data science can transform the economics of discovery. And I'm certainly not the only person who thinks that. And it also opens the door to a shift in the nature of decision making. And here, it's a shift more toward decisions will be increasingly based on data and analysis as opposed to experience and intuition. More science, less gut feel, and rule of thumb. But there's a real caveat here, because at best what we call experience and intuition is actually a huge amount of data synthesized by a human brain, but data that you can't attach a crisp number to. And it's sort of what people talk about design thinking or systems thinking. And there's an anecdote in an episode that occurred at the New York Times years back, a gathering in the boardroom that makes me think of this. And it was early 2010. Apple had introduced the iPad, but it wasn't on sale yet. And Steve Jobs was around showing it off and answering questions. And there were about 13 people in the boardroom from various parts of the paper. So some people knew him, most didn't. So after he does his demonstration, the editor asked what seemed a reasonable question. And, it's a relatively new product category that they were making a big bet on. How much market research went into it? And those of us who knew Jobs kind of knew what the answer was, but it was still fun to hear it. I mean, his answer was none. It's not the consumer's job to know what they want. And Steve Jobs is obviously not a model for a generalization in a way. But one of the things that he always talked about was what he called taste. And taste to him was immersing yourself and exposing yourself to the best your culture has. And again, a lot of this was cultural stuff. And his view was that doing that would enhance your decision making and improve your work, whether you're a software engineer or a fashion designer. So it's not all numbers by any means. Now, data-driven decision making. Haven't we been down this path before? Many times, but most notably a century ago. Frederick Winslow Taylor was the father of what was called scientific management. His time and motion studies were going to revolutionize work at the time. And it's easy to look back at it now, viewed from today, and look at this as a simple-minded efficiency measurement run amok. And he would be satirized by Charlie Chaplin in modern times, machines grinding you up. But in its day, it was seen as a liberating movement. And much of what's being said about data science these days has some eerie, the language is a little bit more Elizabethan, but this kind of it can change everything mentality was very much part of the dialogue then. And it was a force that was going to free workers from the dictates of authoritarian bosses and the economy from price-fixing corporate trusts. It was championed by leading progressives of the day. Louis Brandeis, known as the people's lawyer, who later became a Supreme Court justice. And Ida Tarbell, the muckraking journalist who took on Standard Oil. Is it different this time? Yes. It's qualitatively different. I mean, there's just so much. There's obviously not much of a comparison between the data and artificial intelligence tools today and Taylor's tools, which were stopwatch, a clipboard in his own brain. But that said, of course, that doesn't mean that data technology can't be abused. I mean, again, many of you know far better than I. There's so much data these days, there's always patterns in it. Are they significant? And it's easy to make this the fodder for biased fact-finding missions. I know the facts, now let's find them. So what's worth worrying about? Privacy, real concern. But here, my view is that this really should be manageable, and in good part because we have a healthy marketplace of competing interests that will get us not to a solution, but to an accommodation with this technology. And we've seen that in the past, innumerable times. At the turn of the century, film cameras came on the market. The Brownie eventually cost $1, a lot of money in those days, but still affordable. And so people could take snapshots and photograph people in unguarded moments, as opposed to the old chemistry experiment cameras where you had to be frozen like a stone statue to be photographed. But this spontaneity of photography really scared people. I mean, these people who took snapshots, as they were called camera fiends. They were banned from beaches and from the Washington Monument for a while. In that case, people adapted, social attitudes changed, and things moved on. Sometimes laws are needed. In the 1960s, mainframe computers arrived and amassed large databases of personal information. The IRS had tax returns, credit reporting bureaus had a lot of personal information. There was a lot of talk about a corporate or government big brother. In 1964, the same year the IBM 360 mainframe was introduced, Vance Packard, who was better known for writing The Hidden Persuaders years earlier on the evils of advertising, wrote a book in 1964 called The Naked Society, and it echoed much of what we hear today, including his warning of what he called, quote, the hidden eyes of business. But what emerged were basic rules. First, the Fair Credit Reporting Act in '64, and later, Basic Privacy Act. You had baseline rules. Some practices were banned and changed. There was a workable accommodation, and industries thrived, including consumer finance. And also, people adjust them and make personal adjustments in their behavior. We're seeing, I do it now. My personal concern is much more my credit card transactions being watched than my browsing behavior. I mean, it's what I'm actually doing as opposed to what I might be interested in. So for me, the health club membership goes in the credit card. The liquor bills are with cash. Ed Felton of Princeton, who has a role in this book, was former chief technologist of the Federal Trade Commission. He's a computer security expert. I first ran across him when he testified in the Microsoft trial years ago. But he's a computer scientist and public policy expert. But Ed, when I was talking to him, said he likes Breaking Bad, the television series, and he's interested in how methamphetamine is made, and so he looks it up, but it's always with a separate browser in anonymous mode. Now, whether any of this does any good, I wonder. I think Julie Angwin did a really nice book on computer security. She's now at ProPublica, and kind of where you come out is that there's no way to be a privacy survivalist. It just it doesn't work. But again, we've been this way before. With every significant technology, there's trade-offs. Fire, cook your food with it or burn down your hut. Automobile, people die in car accidents, it pollutes the air, but it's also a vehicle of personal freedom that gave rise to national and regional markets. And I think the bet here is that you're going to see the same pattern of adoption. There'll be some rules, there'll be checks and balances, and social norms change. This technology is just not fundamentally different. And it's a world that we're all going to increasingly live in any case, so you might as well get used to it. But I'm a qualified optimist on that front. Again, in part because the market forces are there. You have a lot of people who are concerned and watching. And so I think that will sort itself out as these things have in the past. I'm going to close with an issue that I think is more subtle, but is concerning, I think. And it's the black box nature of data science in making certain kinds of decisions. Up until now, much of the application has been in things like marketing, ad targeting, product recommendations, and the like. And a fairly prominent data scientist, Claudia Perlich, who used to work at IBM Research and is now working for an ad targeting firm, takes the view that, look, marketing is a great time to experiment with data science. She says, look, if my algorithm's wrong, what happens? Somebody sees the wrong ad. It's not a false positive for breast cancer. And certainly true, but I do think we're moving into realms now where the stakes are getting higher. Data science is being used in medical diagnosis, crime prevention, loan approvals. Is statistical correlation good enough to make decisions that have a lasting effect on someone's life? And I think that's a question we'll wrestle with. And Danny Hillis says, a computer scientist and artificial intelligence expert, says what this technology needs is what he calls an explanatory assistant, an audit trail that traces the data and inferences that went into the mix of a software-generated decision. The technology, Hillis says, must be able to, quote, tell a story about why it did what it did. The key thing that will make it work and make it acceptable to society is storytelling. I agree. And it's a good problem, as they say in computing. Thank you.
Yeah, I was struck by your first two examples, which you sort of lumped together. But it seemed to me one group could actually tell whether what they were doing with big data was effective, which are the drug people who can measure. And the medical guys have more a hope until you have sort of actual sort of peer-reviewed outcome studies. No, medicine is filled with people who have gotten the wrong conclusion from lots of data. So what do you think about correctness?
I make 2 points. I mean, one is partly what I wanted to do here was, and because I was writing to a moving target, was I was looking on the latter side for research projects that are sort of in progress, but that weren't going to be over by the time this book came out, right? And they have real, physical world and commercial implications, but aren't there yet. And that one certainly, the Emory stuff certainly falls into that category. I mean, the one, the McKesson one is interesting in part because you actually get a dollar number. I mean, they kind of did something, and it's also a lot easier, to be fair, because their data was always pretty tame. This was almost all their internal systems. Yeah, there's some weather report stuff put into it. But basically, this was a cake you could bake. I mean, people would argue that that's not really a big data problem, right? I mean, but again, on these sides of things, I think one of the most distortive thing is the big in big data. The numerator you can inflate easily with video, right? I mean, there's a lot of water in the ocean too. You can't drink it. I mean, I think a lot of these problems, like the McKesson one, which I don't, nobody here would think that's big data, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a pretty interesting. It applies the same quantitative.
Yeah, that's the one I believed in. The other
one.
Is...
Yeah, no, absolutely no. Look. We'll see FDA approval, everything that Skid Hammerbacher is doing, right? And everything that Mount Sinai is doing a lot that's interesting. It's Carl Icahn's money. He also has a big institute at Princeton that's doing some of this. I mean, all the genetic stuff. I mean, nothing has done anything to cancer that is anywhere close to quitting smoking, right? I mean, this is always the critique. Now, to say that it isn't there yet isn't. There's a lot of things that aren't there yet, right?
Right.
I mean, you gotta bet on the future.
Well, nothing is done more for medicine than cleaning up the water. Doctors used to be negative value, now they're poking up above zero.
Yeah, and then there's this whole broader argument about whether this stuff is really going to increase productivity and benefit and stuff. And Bob Gordon of Northwestern is the skeptic that makes just your point of view. I mean, nothing of this is close to as close to modern sanitation and toilets, right?
And besides, fire was a really good start. But okay, please, next.
So you mentioned that you think a lot of the privacy concerns can be addressed. And I'm wondering if you think laws are really going to catch up with them, if we need to be more active, especially as we have new ways of gathering data. One example would be many retail stores now have free Wi-Fi for the sole purpose that they can actually track where people physically go, since their phones just automatically connect. And then other companies aggregate that data and they say this person physically walked into a J. Crew or walked into this other scenario, and then they start automatically sending things, and they have it down to your exact device ID number, which can't be reset, so they can trace you everywhere.
Yeah, I mean,
Do we need more active laws? I mean, are we ever
I,
going to?
you know, what you're going to get is it's like the whole debate about the privacy. You know, the Obama privacy proposals have come up. I mean, the good thing is that both sides are opposed. Right? I mean, the Internet Association is, which Google is, they don't like it, and the privacy guys are just up in arms, riddled with loopholes, right? I think you do need some baseline rules to set things up. But I also think from a company standpoint, I think some of this, like the retail example that you mentioned, I think that's something that companies are going to have to decide, what they're doing with, they're going to have, I think there are a lot of things that are going to be legally just fine. And but are going to be a problem they're going to have to deal with. And this is not, I mean, to your retail example, but I digress here. But remember this Facebook thing about when they got in the stream and they put, they could kind
the
of
emotional experiment?
do something. And this is actually, I was still off, and I just come back. What struck me about it was three things. How modest was the intervention, if you looked at the numbers? How slight was the outcome? And how great was the rage? Right? And I think there's a signal there to everybody. Well, don't worry about it. I mean, and getting back to Nest. This is and again, this human control side. I realize this isn't entirely responsive to your laws question, but when they first started with Nest, well before Google bought it, and they did the preliminary testing, and they thought, well, we'll have these sensors. There's a near one, there's a far one, and we'll see how people operate, and then the machine will take over. And people hated that. I mean, and what happened was they did this. They gave people logins so you could constantly check if you want, and little alerts, messages coming back. They still want this. The alert, they didn't change anything. The machine took over, but they had the illusion of control, and they had, to be fair, they had the option if they really wanted to, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that is going to be crucial. But I mean, the answer on technology and law is, well, of course not. That doesn't mean you're not going to get them, right?
Good to hear the Betty Crocker plus break an egg into it moment repeated. For those of you who don't know, when the first cake mixes came out, that they had all you did was add water and bake, and they were quite unpopular with the housewives of the time. Yes, I know what I just said sexistly. It's true. And they fixed it. They did some market studies, and the problem was they felt they weren't adding enough, so they removed the powder egg, made you break an egg into the mixture, and suddenly the sales took off. And no, it didn't taste any better.
Hi. I was very interested in a point you made about how intuition is nothing but, human intuition is nothing but connecting a large amount of data points. But then you also gave an example of Steve Jobs, who, with very little amount of data, knew that the iPad would succeed. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that those large amounts of data, do you think the human brain can connect them in ways that a machine can't? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And in fairness to Jobs on this, I mean, one of the things, he's a great product team leader. Right? This is a guy who's seen a lot. There was a lot of data kind of went into it, right, as well as his own prejudices, right. But yeah, I mean, look, so far, I mean, the reason I hesitate is, people in this room know that better than I. I mean, maybe we just aren't there yet. I mean, there's a lot of people, again, the Ray Kurzweils of the world, forget, it's a done deal. We're just kind of waiting a few years for this to happen. I don't know. A few years back, a colleague of mine, John Markoff, and I, at the Times, did a science series, actually, on artificial intelligence called Smarter Than You Think. It was the rubric we used. And it was probably too early, actually. Actually, the nice thing is John broke the Google car story because of that. But in talking to almost everybody who are real expert on this, I mean, it gets, none of them are religious people, but they had a real awe for what we call generalized human intelligence. And look, the history of AI has been kind of humbling, right? If you go back, I mean, it's, people thought this would all be a lot easier than it could. And yet, the counter argument, of course, is that, look, machines are going to do it differently, but they can do it. I mean, and one of the great pioneers of voice recognition, Fred Jelinek, said to me at the time, he used one of his kind of classic lines, is that airplanes don't flap their wings. And that's, yeah, they'll do it differently, but, they can do it. So, what do I know? I mean, I just, look, history would suggest this has been harder, those kinds of things. And this is, and frankly, the management issue with all of this is, I didn't mention it here, but is also, this stuff has been good for discovery. It's been good for and will be and continue to be. It's not, and knowing more should help you make the big decisions more accurately, but it's not clear that that it's really going to be that, it's really going to help with the big stuff. I mean, look at technology companies. What's the lesson? You get the big stuff right, everything takes care of itself, right? That's what platforms are. But nobody cares about margin point. When you get down to, I remember having this conversation with Gates once. He said, it gets down to a few margin. I'm out of this business, right? And he's gone now. But it's not, it's, so for the people who are creating this, right? The kind of the decision lesson is that, you make that big bet, you get it right. In theory, look at venture capital. Shouldn't a good prediction market be able to do, better than these guys? I mean, yeah, tell that to any venture capitalist, right? Because what do they plug in? Who's your team? What's your idea? Right? Basic business plan. I mean, but it doesn't, we're not there yet. Hold on.
Thanks.
Hi. You mentioned that being a privacy survivalist today is near impossible, and you didn't seem too concerned about that. So I'm wondering, do you think anonymity or the ability to be anonymous is something that is really valued in our society today, or is it something just on the fringes, and should it be? Is it just the privacy advocates, or is this something that people should care more about? And what do you think the impact of the loss of anonymity will be in the years to come?
A few questions there, but look, the evidence would suggest that people don't care that much in the aggregate, right? The issue is one of, I think, asymmetry. I mean, on one side of that screen, you've got, grandma looking for rheumatism remedies and gifts for her grandchild. On the other side of that screen, you've got a PhD quant from Google or someplace trying to maximize his lifetime value, right? And that's just, a fundamentally kind of unfair. The two sides are going into it with different agendas, a different amount of knowledge, and I think that's concerning. But I think most people are going to see value on this. And maybe this, I was just up at MIT, did a story, hasn't run yet, actually, about a young man who essentially diagnosed himself with brain cancer, right? He studied his data. He's an outlier, obviously. But this whole, and the broader point is all this sharing of data, medical data. And there, people, the Harvard Genome Project and stuff, I mean, there are people who really are champions of this. And, he's one of those people who has a stake in it, but, he's 26 years old. But, sees the benefit. And he's look, people of my generation live on data, and we're going to want this. And we're responding to that in a lot of, there's a thing called Open Notes, which allows, now 5 million people to see what their doctors are writing about them, stuff. And the nature of medical information is really easy to put back together, even though more so than a lot of things. I mean, particularly when you get into the genome stuff. I mean, you could take, name, social security, none of that stuff is, going to get you. So potentially, I think it's, it's a big problem. I don't. Of the things I'm worried about, it's just, I don't, and look, partly it's, I was a victim of identity theft the last time I did it, right? And you find out that, it's 10 years ago, and you find out that there's a system, right? And it's, first they charge the $4,500 Cartier watch to the Times credit card, which I had forgotten I had, right? And then, then you cancel everything else, but then, 8 weeks later, you get 10 store credit card bills with charges to your account. And then 6 months later, Morgenthau's office calls you, right? And you say, here's your credit cards. And at that time, because this would have been before 9/11, at that time, I'm not sure about the driver's license, but the medical card had my Social Security number. I mean, you're baked if anybody wants you, right? And the issue is, and there's no changing bank accounts doesn't really help and stuff, but what there is, it was a system of crime, right? That at each, there's the guy who dropped it, and the people dropped it off and made false identification, and then there was the guy who was the harvester, who would be the equivalent of a website now, right? And what you realized is, this old thing about the bear in the track shoes, two guys running and stuff, and the guy's putting, you can't outrun the bear. No, I don't have to outrun the bear. I have to outrun you. And I think, I feel that way about myself personally. I mean, I just, I'm nobody. Why would anybody be interested in me, right? To exploit? And I don't. I guess it's just a long-winded answer to say that I don't. Real anonymity is a tough thing. I mean, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure we want it. Except for certain people, and then it's a premium product. There should be a marketplace, right?
Just by the way, for people on this side of the room, there is actually a nice table back there where books are being sold. So you may not be able to see them by angle, like the pile is shrinking, so you may decide to go over there. Please. This was a paid commercial announcement.
Thank you. So I see that there's a lot more data, but I'm not sure that there's an education system to support that understanding of data. So I know that data is expanding, but looking at the curriculum of my brother who's in high school and seeing the curriculum of my previous college, it doesn't seem like there's more people enrolled in trying to understand this sort of data. So my observation is that there's sort of a danger in this gap, because sometimes in my role, I'll present a data point, and there's no questions about where that data came from. And if you talk about a certain significance, it's sometimes there's blank stares depending on which audience. So I can imagine if you're telling a guy you have X percentage chance of getting a certain disease and he doesn't know what that means, he could think he could, die tomorrow. So I'm just wondering if you think my observation is accurate, and two, if within the data community, and even within government and I guess the education community, if this is something that is recognized.
Yeah, data institutes, as they say, are cropping up all over the place. I mean, and this is how universities experiment with new things without starting a department, obviously, right? And so, look, Columbia's got one. I think all sorts of places are doing this, and we're pushing some of the more a bunch of foundations are lined up to push this more. A lot of it has to do with, and it depends on what level you're talking about. General population knowledge or experts. And McKinsey did this study 2 or 3 years ago about what we need from a workforce standpoint. And I think off the top of my head, it's is 140 to 190,000 really literate data quants. But what you really need is the 1.5 million sort of managers who are savvy about data to kind of let it spread through the world, right? And I think, look, I just look at what's happened to journalism in my lifetime in terms of, it used to be even economics was something you kind of, people didn't do, right? I was interested in it, so I was an outlier. But, kind of it was all anecdote and, the old cliche was once is a coincidence, twice is a trend, right? That's changed dramatically. I mean, we have, I digress. I mean, because you can really take a shot at it from a statistical standpoint. I mean, Upshot, Nate Silver, Vox. I mean, I think we should have a manifesto that says, this is stuff that boldly goes between, case study journalism and real statistical significance. I mean, we run a lot more stuff that has, this is based on a longitudinal study of 47 men in Denmark. And we did how people study, self-reported studies of 147 people who are unemployed and how they spent their time. It's really interesting, huge amount of interest in it stuff. But it isn't, I'm not sure it's sort of grappled with. But my sense is that, Stu would probably know more about this than I would, but I mean, my sense is that in universities and, I don't know about high schools, but, more and more of this is, is kind of part of the language. And ordinary people, the difference between correlation and causation. I mean, it just is more, for example, it's just something that people think more about. I mean, Stu, you probably know.
Well, I'll just ask, how many people here know the people in their families or friends who complain bitterly when last night it said there was a 70% chance of rain tomorrow and it doesn't rain? So obviously they don't know what they're talking about. And you say, what do you think 70% means in the end? And that's been, everybody in this room grew up with that custom of data interpretation. So I'm curious what you think about the educability, given that people, you look at all these behavioral economic studies that suggest people don't really understand probability.
Because I'm not so much concerned about the pushers, right? I know these institutions exist and the curriculum is there for people who are very interested in data, and you can be very good at it, but that's still a very niche part of the population. It's the receivers that I'm worried about, because it's very easy, I think, to... Privacy is a concern, but also kind of misuse of this power of data. Because you can tell someone a number, they don't know what that number means, and then you can really manipulate people in that way. And there's really no protection against that.
May I commend to you an old classic book, just by the way, before we go on? It's entitled How to Lie with Statistics.
Exactly.
It's a wonderful book.
Okay.
And I think of it every time that I see certain newspapers do interesting graphs. The other newspapers don't even do graphs.
I mean, it doesn't really, none of us are answering your question really, but I mean, it sort of depends on what you mean by people. I mean, if you're really looking at the population as a whole, I mean, look at popular taste and stuff. I mean, I think you're talking about people who influence things, right? Who can shape things, and I see that in. Look, I see that in education generally, and I mean, the analogy I use in the book is Dartmouth in the '60s teaching basic. Right, the whole idea was this was C.P. Snow's Two Cultures. The people, what you're talking about, people who understood the technology and people ruled by it, and therefore the whole idea that John Kemeny and Tom Kurtz used for the rationale for starting up basic at Dartmouth was that people who are people who are potentially future leaders, whether they're flattering themselves or not, should be exposed to this. By God, as Brian Kernahan of C++.
Over there, I think.
All it says is
you'll see Brian right over there.
Oh, really? He's going to make the little varmints program up in at Princeton. He at least teaches this course, right? That shows these kind of basics of computing to undergraduates who are not computer science majors. And I just I think we're going to get more of it over time. It's almost inescapable. The regulatory issue is sort of another one. I think we're seeing all kinds of sort of popular signs that this is. I mean, again, journalism is part of it, as are other things. That more of this is taking hold.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, last one, please.
So I think over the last, maybe the 20th century, you had sort of graphs. You could graph maybe the way that subcultures tend to develop they start out as a very niche market, and then a group of people sort of surrounds around it, and eventually the successful ones become hip and they become in mainstream culture, and then eventually they become monetized. And I guess I think today that graph is collapsing a lot, and that sort of cycle is happening a lot faster. I was wondering if you thought that had any dangers for sort of homogenizing our culture and making people more likely to not branch out and explore smaller subcultures and maybe limiting their ability to be successful.
Sure, potentially. I believe in free will. It's like, nobody's telling you to have the machine on. Nobody. I mean, a lot of this is, I think, is being an adult and individual responsibility. And you can't. I remember FTC commissioner said to me, and never quote me on this, you can't protect people from every dumb thing they're going to do. And I don't, sort of the shaping power of, whether it's media or technology, I hear you. And it's absolutely true in a sense, but the way we deal with this is as individuals. And I think that's part of what being a kind of an informed adult is about. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks,
It's always a pleasure reading you, and even more a pleasure seeing you.